Hello, good afternoon. My name is Sebastian Rodriguez, and I am a campaign strategist at the European Movement International and also the communications lead at The Real Deal. Welcome to our first episode of our series of webinars, online sessions called Building a Green and Just Future for All, where we are going to bring policymakers, decision makers, practitioners, researchers, people working in civil society, activists together to discuss exactly that, how we can create a more inclusive and a more participatory society. We're gonna do that, as I said, in a series of webinars. Today is the first one, but then check out our website, realdeal.eu, to find out more about the upcoming ones. We have a very interesting one on how to communicate the European Green Deal coming up in July. But today, what we have is we're going to focus on how to engage marginalized and underrepresented groups in the green and just transition. And to do that, we wanted to invite people who are going to cover, who are going to give a response from different angles. And we're very excited to have them. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our moderator who kindly accepted our invitation to participate in this event. Her name is John Lenders. She's policy officer at the Fair Green and Digital Transition Research Unit in DG Employ at the European Commission. You should see her in a sec. Hello, good afternoon.
Hello, good afternoon, and thank you for having me, and welcome everyone to this webinar on building a green and just future for all. The case for engaging marginalized and underrepresented groups. So as Sebastian already mentioned, I'm a policy officer at DG Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion in the European Commission, and I will moderate this webinar today. I am joined by a diverse range of speakers with vast expertise on different areas and equality, inclusion of marginalized groups. And we will benefit today from hearing their insights on how to involve and engage marginalized groups in participatory democracy around the European Green Deal. And so hopefully by the end of this webinar, we will have a better awareness and maybe even some concrete ideas on how to ensure everyone's voices are heard in the development of environmental policies and strategies. So first, I would like to outline a bit of the policy context also from the Commission side. And I would like to start by saying that inequalities are at the heart of the climate crisis and transition. So as highlighted by the IPCC, vulnerability to climate hazards is exacerbated by inequity and marginalization. For instance, also linked to gender, ethnicity, low incomes, disability, age, and other intersecting factors. Access to essential services is another challenge, and here energy poverty in particular. There's a lot of research that women are more affected by this, such as single mothers and older women, and transport poverty also has a stronger gender dimension to this with different mobility patterns and needs. With a complementary set of policies, strategies, and initiatives, we can then make sure that the green transition becomes fair and socially inclusive. So to outline a few measures that take place at the EU level, fairness and solidarity are, of course, an integral part of the European Green Deal, which underlined that no person and no place should be left behind in the green transition. This is also very much in line with the principles of the European Pillar of Social Rights. And to respond to this, the Commission put forward key initiatives in 2021 in the area of climate and energy as part of the Fit for 55 package. It's a very known term by now. In this package, social fairness and elements are also built into the design of many proposals, and I would like to highlight a few here that we also work on in the context or as part of DG Employment's work for social rights and inclusion. So you may have heard of the Council recommendation on ensuring a fair transition towards climate neutrality, which the member states unanimously adopted in June last year. And this outlines a comprehensive policy package to ensure no one is left behind and to fairly spread the costs and opportunities of the green transition. So, for example, member states aim to ensure equal access to education, training, and lifelong learning for the transition, and to particularly attract also women and young students in STEM education and careers. We know that there are huge gender gaps in STEM, and this will become particularly important for getting more jobs in the green transition as well. This is also very much in line with the skills agenda and the Green Deal Industrial Plan, which also puts this emphasis on inclusiveness of women and youth. Um, Another part of the recommendation looks into reviewing and, where applicable, adapting social protection systems, including social inclusion policies. And this also concerns access to affordable and accessible health and long term care. And then finally, the recommendation envisages a participatory and an inclusive whole of society approach to empower and enable civil society and organizations that represent people in precarious situations and also in vulnerable situations. So now, looking ahead, it is up to the member states to implement this recommendation, and in autumn, we will conduct a first progress review with member states in specific policy areas to monitor and support their implementation. And we are also advancing research and analysis, for instance, on green jobs and transport poverty with many experts. And of course, the Real Deal project is under the Horizon program very much part of this to support our policies also with evidence based analysis. Moreover, on top of that, I would also like to highlight that the optimal use of public and private funding is key for supporting a just transition. And in this regard, the Social Climate Fund can help support vulnerable households, transport users, and micro enterprises in the light of the proposed revision of the emissions and trading system in sectors like buildings and road transport. So this fund is very much plan and performance based. That means that member states will have to submit their national social climate plans by June in 2025. And the Social Climate Fund is now entering its implementation phase, where the Commission will, of course, provide a lot of guidance and support also to member states. So since this project, the Real Deal, is very much focused on democracy and participatory processes, I also wanted to highlight here that equality mainstreaming is a key component of the European Democracy Action Plan. Here, women, LGBTIQ persons, people with an ethnic minority background, persons with disabilities, and persons from low income households are explicitly addressed. And in this regard, the plan envisages also more concrete solutions on encouraging the use of EU structural funds to fund civil society and to build capacity for deliberative civic engagement and political participation. And then finally, there's also um, a proposal on fighting hate speech and to promote the respect in public debate by extending the list of EU crimes to hate crime and hate speech. This is very important. This was a proposal that was communicated in 2021, and it should then hopefully trigger a council decision in this area as well. And then, of course, the citizens panels, which were one of the main outcomes on of the conference on the future of Europe, are also a very good example of how to strengthen citizen engagement and ensure a more inclusive public debate when it comes to policy areas on the green transition. So I want to conclude with a few more practical points for this webinar. Please feel free to write your questions in the little chat box throughout the whole webinar while the other speakers speak. You can also write in the comment section of your social media platform like Twitter or LinkedIn where you are following the Real Deal project with the hashtag Real Deal Europe. And since we have an hour today, we would like to make the discussion as interactive and engaging as possible. So therefore, I would also like to ask the speakers to keep their interventions short or their answers so that there's enough time for questions afterwards. So with this, I would like to give the floor to Nadia Haddad. She is the co-chair of the European Network on Independent Living, and she will share a bit more her experiences and perspectives on how people with disabilities can be included in the green and just transition. Nadia, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Jean, and thank you for the organizers to having us today here. Firstly, I will start with the EU Green Deal. When the EU Green Deal is addressing transport, built environment, virtual environment, and communications, and they are not accessible, more than 115 million of Europeans with disability will be excluded. That's why accessibility is a basic human right in itself, but also a precondition for accessing other rights. So it's not only the built environment or public transport, but also the communication responding to different disability needs like sign languages, easy to read, being able to use screen readers, and so on should be included. In many cases, separate provisions need to be made for persons with disability, which are more expensive and less sustainable than accessibility solutions. That's why including integral accessibility from the beginning in the planning and the concept phases reduce cost and leads to a better outcome. Another thing is smart and sustainable mobility. When investing in intelligent transport system or when focusing on rail travel rather than air travel, measures need to be taken to make rail also accessible for persons with disability. Actually, for example, wheelchair users in many countries need to make a reservation between 24 until 48 hours before they can take a train. So to allow passengers with disability to make sustainable choices, such as switching from using a private car to rail travel, special attention shall be paid, may be paid to make it accessible and affordable for everyone, independently from their support needs, using the principle show up and get on. Another point is strengthening the social, human right, and gender dimension by putting a stronger focus on including persons with disability in, for example, the regular labor market through the emerging opportunities that the Green Deals bring out. So attention should be also paid to leave no one behind in the transition process of the economy, for example, by providing trainings and allowing provisions for reasonable accommodation measures and improving accessibility. And also, the EU Green Deal should not lead to improvement in Europe at the expense for the global south or groups in society that are already marginalized. The well-being, the income, access to goods and services for persons with disability should not be negatively impacted. So, a second point is how to guarantee the involvement of organizations of persons with disability and their partners in the EU policies. So, inclusive planning and meaningful involvement during the consultation and the decision-making process should be integrally accessible, including communication and stakeholder participation has to be inclusive, allowing for reimbursement of all the costs and adequate remuneration for disabled persons and experts. Adapt a human right compliant approach in all climate actions. So efforts should be adequately sufficiently ambitious, non-discriminatory, or otherwise compliant with the responsibilities of the states and other duty barriers, including business, under international, regional, and national human rights obligation. We need also to adapt plans on different levels. Why? To mitigate the climate change and to prevent its negative human rights impact, to ensure also that all persons have the necessary capacity to adapt to climate change, to ensure accountability and effective remedy of the human rights harms caused by climate change, and also to mobilize the maximum available resources for sustainable human rights based development and to protect human rights from business harms, and to ensure equity in the climate action. A fourth point is the importance of capacity building on climate adaptation. Trainings are crucial to guarantee qualitative and meaningful participation of persons with a disability and to guarantee the expertise born in their experience. So, for example, the transition to a greener economy leaves no one behind, and the Just Transition funds need to support member states in ensuring this transition is done in a way that promotes security, social inclusion, employment, and accessibility for persons with disability. So all our members must be armed to participate. And the last point is our priorities. So the consequences of climate change are especially severe for members of the disability community that experience intersecting forms of discrimination, including women, children, indigenous people, and other minority groups. For those experience also poverty, and for the underrepresented groups of persons with disabilities, such as persons with intellectual or psychosocial disabilities, deaf-blind persons, those living in institutions, or other forms of segregated settings. So, in addition to be more exposed to the impact of the climate change, persons with disability may also be adversely affected by the state's responses to climate change. Policies to reduce carbon emission, such as carbon pricing schemes or the ban of carbon intensive products, are often designed without consideration of the rights, perspective, and the requirement of the disability community and do not address the differential costs and burdens that these may impose on individuals with disabilities. So these type of ableist climate mitigation policies create barriers for persons with disabilities and reinforce social inequalities. So the European Disability Forum worked a lot on these topics, and you can find a lot of resources on their website. So let's collaborate all together to make climate justice a reality for all and to guarantee that the EU Green Deal and the Just Transition Program includes not only persons with disability, but all the minorities, and regardless of the support they may need, and also become a real deal for all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Nadia, for this very comprehensive and a good overview of some key recommendations for making it also more inclusive for persons with disabilities. Um, Before delving into any questions, I think we can move on to the next speakers, and then afterwards we can address more questions to you specifically, and this way we leave a bit more time to the audience to come up with questions. So please, Miriam Dur, if you could take the floor. Miriam is a campaigner at the Friends of the Earth of Europe, and she will make the crucial connection between the Green Deal and ecofeminism. In the principle also with nothing about us without us. So please, Miriam, if you could take the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. I hope everybody can hear me okay. Otherwise, I'll just be looking at the chat for feedback on that. But yeah, thank you for having me. I think this is a very crucial discussion to be having today. Especially, I'll echo a lot of what Nadia said earlier. I very much agree with everything that she said. I think it's undeniable that climate change exacerbates existing inequalities, and so the root causes of a lot of the climate disaster that we see today, which are capitalism, colonial capitalism, the kind of economic system that we live in that is based on exploitation of both humans and resources, are the root causes of the situation we're in today. And they're also what is causing a lot of the inequalities, be it racism, sexism, ableism, etc. So it really is just a compounding effect on existing inequalities and the first people impacted by the climate crisis are the ones that are the most vulnerable people. And unfortunately, they're the least listened to in the EU, but also elsewhere. And for me, one main issue that when you look at EU policy is that it is very much a siloed issue. So we have very fragmented policy files and discussions that are about a specific topic, but that don't necessarily talk to each other. For instance, after the 2020 uprising, we had the action plan on anti-racism that the EU came out with the coordinator that had almost no reference to climate and the Green Deal that was happening simultaneously. I think there were some efforts afterwards, after some feedback was given, but the kind of, and what Nadia said is, the earlier you take things and you anticipate, the better in terms of policymaking and inclusion, and that didn't happen. And it kind of is the reflex of having things in silo that don't necessarily are holistic decision making, which is what we need when we tackle something so big as the climate crisis and the social crisis that goes with it. It's really important. I'll talk a bit about racialized community mainly as a racial justice activist, but marginalized communities around the world are intentionally or unintentionally often faced with the worst effect of the environmental hazard, be it air pollution, dumping of waste, toxic waste, etc. And they're not listened to by decision makers, but also sometimes by the climate movement. So mainstream climate organization, there's also a bit of work to do there for them to make sure that they also represent the interest and the kind of point of view of marginalized groups and marginalized communities. And it is really something that needs to be done both. We've heard a lot in 2020, right? That was the big thing. Everybody was kind of reconsidering and making sure that racial justice was at the heart of what they are doing. We're now in 2023, and I'm not sure that this effort has followed up as much from all the angles that I'm looking at. And it is really a pity, because these organizations do have access to the EU institutions, and the ways of engaging with decision making is kind of there are a lot of obstacles when it comes to that. So it's not enough to just put out a consultation and expecting answers from people, especially when we talk about marginalized communities who maybe have less access to decision makers, to technology, to etc. Being in Brussels, which is a level kind of removed from the general public, let's say, there needs to be more effort made by the institutions to reach out to people and find them where they're at, and also accepting the fact that the solutions are not one size fits all, that the solutions to our many problems will be as many as there are local communities and as many as there are different people with different perspectives, and we can't just fit everything into a mold. And unfortunately, what we've been seeing a lot is the way that institutions, and specifically the Commission, have been making decision is by referring to industry as the expertise. So it is kind of the irony of the fossil fuel industry, for instance, has created the situation we're in today, and yet we are going to them for expertise and solutions. The Commission, the van der Leyen Commission, has created countless industry alliances, which are kind of ways for industry to give their expertise. It's almost institutionalized lobbying in a way that they don't even need to reach out to the Commission. There's an alliance that's built for them to come and give their thoughts. We did a bit of an assessment from the beginning of the van der Leyen mandate. The Commission, so the data we have is unfortunately only for commissioners, their cabinet, and director general, so really the top level officials in the Commission. And since the beginning of the mandate up until the halfway, so last spring, they had met with fossil fuel lobbyists the equivalent of every working day. Which is huge, which is also just crowding the space, right? If you spend all your time talking to industry lobbyists, then you have no time talking to other people who may not have access, may not be as loud, may not be able to have the capacity to talk that much. They don't necessarily have the money and the staff and the people that are there. So it is really crucial that this is something that decision makers be aware of. And we saw that last year. I think one huge example that we need to not forget is also the energy crisis that we just went through, that is not over, far from over. But when people had to choose between heating their homes and eating, the commission was meeting with fossil fuel executives who made billions, unprecedented profits that, we heard numbers that kind of would spin your head and make you dizzy. And that reflects the kind of rationale and the way of acting is, oh, let's go to the industry for expertise, when it's no, there's the people in situations of energy poverty. It's the people who have issues paying their bills that need to be listened to. So it's really, I think, that it's making more of the effort. It's trying to reach out to communities that are not necessarily listened to, and don't necessarily have the access that that industry has. And for that, I think we need to less crowd the space to leave room for those groups to be heard. I'll just stop here, and we can get into it more with the questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miriam. Always very much appreciated to have a more critical perspective. And so, of course, we also take note of the very fragmented picture of all the initiatives that are sometimes going on. And it's hard to see where that all links together, especially with now the Commission having this equality coordinator and equality task force to mainstream equality in all funding policies and programs. So with that, I would move to the next speaker, Lavinia, who's a policy officer at Solidar, working on international cooperation. And Lavinia will guide us through the more global aspects of participation in the European Green Deal and shed some light on the international perspective. So Lavinia, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Jeanne. Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be able to discuss a perspective that is often not considered in the discourse around the European Green Deal just transition, except for these kind of spaces that we are having, and is the perspective of the Global South, which Nadia already touched upon. So we are, as you may have noticed, we are living in a globalized world where ambitious policies brought forward by powers like the EU inevitably entail effects and consequences on other countries. And even if these kind of consequences can be positive in some cases, there are still significant negative spillovers effects of EU countries and EU policies on the rest of the world that need to be tackled. Just to give you some numbers, according to the Fair Trade Advocacy Office data, the EU consumption is associated with 1.2 million people in forced labor and 10% of global deforestation. And I mean, the EU is aware of the negative externalities, and there are some corrective measures in place, but these are not sufficient. Another issue that I want to touch upon is the issue of the green extractivism. So to sustain our own transition to a zero carbon economy, we are hindering the one in partner countries. Just to name a few concrete examples, the lithium extraction in Argentina, which is used for electric vehicles here, or the balsa wood in Ecuador, which is devastating communities and it's devastating the Ecuadorian Amazon forest. This balsa wood is used to build the wind turbines. So, and those that are the most affected by this are the indigenous people and the local communities there, for whom there is very hardly any support for adaptation or mitigation, or more in general, just transition strategies. So at Solidar, we have been running a series of workshops with the purpose of creating a narrative on just transition for the Global South. And during these workshops, participants shared many testimonies that are really worrying. For example, there was a participant from Kenya that was explaining us how European-owned companies, for example, tile makers, they are setting up factories in the Maasai lands. And this brings benefits in terms of employment for the local communities, but it entails environmental and social effects which are devastating, such as destroying the forest and draining swamps in an area which is already affected by drought. And also, since the government is giving ancestral lands away to these companies, there is no land left for cattle grazing, and the local way of life is threatened. If we move a bit west and we look at countries such as Colombia or Guatemala, there were peace agreements that included commitments to the protection of indigenous people rights, and there is also the ratification of the ILO Convention 169 on indigenous and tribal people, but the implementation remains still an enormous challenge in terms of providing safe spaces for genuine dialogue, consultation, and also participation of these indigenous peoples in the decision-making processes. And there are still land-related tensions and conflicts, which are frequent, and the access to remedies for them is simply non-existent. Another point that I would like to raise is the fact that very often, and this is very important, the whole concept of sustainability or just transition and so on, it's already there. Indigenous communities have a precious knowledge, and they have been at the forefront in making connections across the human rights, climate change, and peace agendas. And even the concept of just transition, as we know it, in many countries is not even a concept that is used by grassroots movements. It's something that is kind of being forced upon them, and they have to speak in that language. In India, for example, they call it the under the blue sky approach. In Latin America, there is the concept of buen vivir, or the concept of vivir sabroso from Guatemala, or the cosmogonia of the Awa people in Colombia. And all these concepts refer to a way of living in harmony with nature, meeting everyone's needs within the planet's boundaries, which is exactly what we should aim when we talk about just transition. So to wrap up my recommendations, which is also the answer to the title of this webinar, concrete solution, how to involve them. To involve the Global South countries, we need to foster partnerships that are based on a mutual respect and shared benefits. We need to acknowledge the historical responsibility that developed nations have and provide financial and technological support to enable the Global South to transition to a greener future. And in doing so, as for example, Miriam has already mentioned, we must address the barriers that hinder the participation of marginalized and underrepresented groups in the just transition. So the EU shall promote a meaningful and structured dialogue with the organizations representing marginalized groups and involve them in policy formulation and implementation. Also involving indigenous communities in the European Green Deal requires recognizing their traditional and ancestral knowledge, which I already mentioned. Indigenous communities have very valuable insights on sustainable practices, and their inclusion is not only a matter of justice, but it's also a great opportunity for us Europeans to learn from their wisdom and to integrate their practices into our strategies. We need to feed kind of bottom-up processes and rights-based approaches to entrust a greater role to indigenous people and to implement mechanisms that ensure the consultation with civil society and local communities in partner countries. To conclude, involving marginalized and underrepresented groups, including the Global South countries and indigenous communities in the EGD is not just an ethical imperative that we have, but is also a strategic necessity, because climate change doesn't have boundaries, and we must approach it as a collective, leaving no one behind. And we need to embrace diversity and amplifying the voices and ensure that the opportunities are equally distributed. So in doing so, we can achieve a green and just transition that can benefit us all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lavinia. Very concrete recommendations as well, and really enriching to have this sort of international perspective also on indigenous communities that are unfortunately sometimes left out of the process. So Federico Tereni is our next speaker. He is a policy and advocacy manager at the European Movement International, and I would hand the floor to him now.
Yes, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me fine. Thanks again for the invitation, and I also wish to thank the fellow speakers for their contributions. A lot of very, very good points have been made and important recommendations have been highlighted. So I will try to add a few elements to this conversation also to avoid repetitions. And it's also very, very welcome to agree on a lot of important points. And my quick contribution will essentially focus on my experience and all the process around the conference on the future of Europe, which was mentioned by you, Jean, at the beginning of this workshop. And I believe that as an exercise and as a process, we can learn a lot from the conference. It was a never seen before opportunity for citizens from all walks of life, from all over Europe, randomly selected, that had the chance to take part in the decision-making process and actively contribute to the deliberations in an interesting exercise in which deliberative and participatory democracy merged very, very successfully, and also to see how democracy in the European Union should be improved. The main aspect, the most innovative and very successful element was the fact that citizens were really put at the heart of the decision-making process. And through a set of different initiatives, starting from the citizens panels that you, Jean, have mentioned, that were the key innovation and also the very successful ones, citizens had the chance really to come together, take stock of what's been achieved and what's to be done. So in that sense, this exercise was very, very successful because it also ensured a very good collaboration between elected representatives, political stakeholders, citizens, as well as representatives from civil society, the trade unions, local and regional governments, to really work together. They were put in the same room and come up with concrete recommendations. So with regards to today's discussion, to the topics of this recommendation, there are certainly some key learnings and recommendations that I believe can be of use in this debate. Firstly, what really came very strongly in this process was that citizens realized that democracy cannot take for granted. The democracy is in danger. And for this reason, it is truly necessary to join forces, to work together, to involve as many stakeholders and groups as possible to improve the democratic functioning of the European Union and beyond. For this reason, participatory processes represent really an invaluable tool to strengthen our democracies. Because what we've seen was really that citizens see Europe as a solution to the challenges they're facing. They really have a voice, they really have a lot to say, and they need to be included in the process. Another interesting recommendation was that really we've seen also have some progress, is that we very much welcome the fact that the European Commission has been working towards their formalization of citizens panels into the democratic life of the EU institutions, which is really a very, very good exercise and a very welcome initiative. We had the opportunity to follow the previous citizens panels, and that was a very interesting exercise. And technically, we're expecting more to come, which is also welcome news. At the same time, firstly, with regards to marginalized and underrepresented groups, it's clear that a lot more has to be done. Because if you look at the composition and representation of the Conference on the Future of Europe, it is very true that citizens were randomly selected. The Commission really took care of involving a very strong young component at respecting gender balance, but marginalized and underrepresented groups were essentially not there. It was pretty much a white exercise, to be fair. So there's really a lot of room for improvement. And this, of course, had clear repercussions also in the debate, in the topics that were discussed and approved. Then, of course, if you go through the final recommendations, which are really, truly commonsensical, very progressive and valid, you can easily find a lot of elements related to equality, progress, also some intersectionality with issues related to environmental policy, sustainability. But certainly a lot more can be done, because it's necessary to ensure equal access to power through this bottom-up citizens-oriented processes, which is something that Lavinia also mentioned, and I very much agree with that. To conclude, a few extra quick points. Well, one, I've essentially already mentioned it, which is really that this constructive dialogue between citizens, EU institutions, civil society, and other groups has to continue, has to be certainly improved, but has to continue. And then with respect to essentially the debate on the green and just transition, the European Green Deal, it is very important to involve underrepresented groups, marginalized groups, and also experts in this debate, in the choice of topics, in setting the agenda. Miriam made the point of a very, very valid point around the fact that the industries were essentially the main voice and the main partner in some of these conversations. And of course, this has to change. Some change is necessary over there. And on the other hand, when we talk about this participatory and deliberative democracies, is also very important to ensure a clear bottom-up exercise, but also with a clear follow-up and a specific agenda. This is maybe something that during the conference on the future of Europe was missing. So it's very good to understand what's at stake, what are the objectives, and how to achieve them. So, voilà. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Federico, and very good to hear that also you have been involved in the citizens panels and that this has been a positive exercise for you. But of course, we also can do better when it comes to representation and participation and not just having a fully white panel. So I think we can start straight with the questions. There are already some coming in. There's one for Lavinia. On what is your opinion about the Global Citizens Assembly for the COP26 and what would be the next steps? Lavinia, please.
Thank you very much. Well, I think that the Global Citizens Assembly was a very nice exercise and a very good way to show how to involve citizens and accelerate the action through people power. I'm not sure about the next steps, to be honest. It's just that these kind of exercises really need to be put in place, ensuring that everyone has access. So I'm talking about really concrete details. For example, the communities that I'm working with, so the Global South, as I mentioned, the indigenous communities, sometimes even the access to technology is limited. So sometimes it's not enough just to organize this kind of platforms, but we need to really go into deep at the local level to the communities and ensure that the participation is guaranteed. So I hope that it was a very short answer, but I hope it was enough. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lavinia. So while we leave the audience maybe a bit more time to come up with their questions, I would also have a question myself. We talked a lot about marginalized communities, but maybe this is not always clear what it means, and it can also differ depending on cultural context or different national contexts. So what would be some of the communities that we may not have talked about so much today, but that are very relevant when it comes to participatory decision making, also on the Green Deal and other environmental policies? I see you nodding, Frederic.
Yeah, I can maybe quickly answer with all the aspects related to my intervention. That I've said a lot the word citizens, and certainly we should also talk about involving non-citizens, because we also need to take into account the fact that in Europe and beyond, there are so many people that are stateless, that are certainly, for the case of the European Union, they're citizens coming from non-EU member states, and they very often, if not all the time, may not have direct access to information, access to power, to participatory tools, because even if the EU treaties really give the opportunity to citizens to really make use of a quite broad variety of tools to participate in the democratic life of the European Union, well, very, very often these tools are not accessible to non-citizens. So, of course, perhaps I can take advantage of this moment to say that maybe an extra recommendation would be really to take into account also non-citizens in this debate, especially for those citizens that often are heavily affected by the climate crisis and other factors, especially in a moment in which I'm again referring to the European Union. The future of the European Green Deal post 2024 next year is very murky, because already in Brussels, when we talk about what's coming next, the European Green Deal Part 2, there are already very, very serious concrete concerns about what's next. So certainly involving also these groups would be essential.
Thank you, Federico. I think that's also a very relevant point. Another question for all, actually. Are there any specific tools, resources, or guidelines that you would recommend for organizations that seek to implement inclusive and participatory practices in their environmental projects? Maybe Nadia, or I don't know if anyone would like to give it a shot.
Yeah, I can try. So maybe from the beginning, when they start to plan any project to involve the marginalized or those who are usually not there. And so it's really from the brainstorm session that we need to see who is missing around the table, what is needing to bring them over, how can we support them so that they can come and stay on and make them part of the project. And it's not only by consulting, because consulting is not enough. Then you are just an object. So it's really involving, and then also provide the budget that is needed, because a lot of organizations representing those minorities are in the kind of surviving instincts with daily matters. So for some of them, climate justice, climate impact, doing lobby work on it is something new. So they also need to be trained and have the opportunity to be trained, so that when they are around the table, that they can say something decently and that they have also impact on their participation, and they should be part of the implementation and also the monitoring mechanism. So during the whole process of the project, they need to be considered as equal as the others. And if they need more time to give feedback, if they need special support or accommodations, that should be also included from the beginning, so that we are really sure that we leave no one behind.
Thank you so much, Nadia. Very clear. In line with this, similar question, maybe some of you have some more positive examples or better stories of where this has actually worked effectively and where people can look to as a best practice. Don't know if anyone wants to volunteer. Miriam, maybe.
I can try and go. I don't know that I have an example related to EU policy, but I think another thing I would add to what Nadia said is also who's designing that project, who's in so the question was about organizations seeking to implement, who's in the organization. Is your organization white, middle class, European privileged people? Then it's much harder to think about other perspectives than when you make sure that you hire people with different backgrounds and different perspectives that will bring this value to your organization. There's one organization that comes to mind that's a local initiative in France, in the banlieue, which is a union called Front de Mère, so Front of the Mothers, which is an organization that was created by mothers to kind of bring awareness. It started with asking more organic and vegetarian options in the school meals, etc. And they were confronted with a lot of racism and classism, and that they built an organization, and they have now kind of a center that they created in their neighborhood to raise awareness around climate action, and really involving the population and thinking about what solutions for them look like, and they are designing themselves the solution. And I think that's really something that if the people are coming with solution, they know what's best for them. Like Lavinia said, also, Indigenous people know what fits for them, and people know best what is right for them, and we just need to listen to them and make sure that they have a platform to showcase that.
Thank you, Miriam. Very inspiring example at a smaller local level then also. I can imagine that a lot of these, the campaigning work, the activism, it also meets with a lot of resistance, as you said, and also the racism or sexism that you may encounter in your work. So I'm wondering also, how are you dealing with this? If you meet resistance from other interest groups or the people that you engage with. not, I mean, maybe for Miriam or other speakers.
I can give a short answer. I mean, for us, it's mainly because so Friends of the Earth is an international federation. So we have groups all over the world that have had to deal with a lot of issues that Federico also referred to, in the sense that democracy is at threat. I mean, we see kind of repressive regimes around the world, but I'm worried that we see that more and more in Europe. I mean, as we're speaking today, yesterday, France decided to dissolve an environmental organization, and the way that the French government has been dissolving organizations for the past few years since the beginning of the mandate is really, really worrying. It's about, and the main issues they have with them are freedom of expression issues. There are videos that they shared, statement that they made, etc. It's really very scary for me to see that organizations trying to affect change are more repressed than big business and companies that are creating the issue that and the situation we're in today. So yes, there is resistance from people, but it's mainly from the powers that be. It's mainly from companies and from governments. So I think this is something we really need to seriously think about within the EU and what that looks like for us.
Okay. Yes, it's true that it's very also much from an institutional, organizational source where the resistance actually comes from, at all levels, also at national level. So I see that there is another bit more broader question. How can we ensure that the voices and perspectives of indigenous communities are integrated in environmental policies and initiatives? Lavinia, would you like to give it a try?
Sure, thank you very much. So, well, this goes pretty much back to my recommendation. So, as I said, first we need to understand why it's important, and like safeguarding and leveraging and learning from indigenous people's knowledge and practices. It's fundamental because their knowledge and expertise is key, and it's fundamental that they have means to participate in the decision-making process, and we need to recognize them as crucial agents of change and essential partners and allies for sustaining inclusive development. And also we need to strengthen and give a comprehensive support to indigenous peoples in the context of when it comes to climate change mitigation and adaptation. So we need to develop and implement support measures and programs, and we need to involve, when I talk about indigenous people in general, but we need to involve and ensure the participation of indigenous women and men and indigenous youth and indigenous persons with disabilities. So it's a broad concept that includes all the communities that we have discussed today. So yeah, as I said, it's fundamental, the bottom-up approach and rights-based approach. These, I think, are the basis to start to ensure the inclusion of these underrepresented communities.
Thank you so much, Lavinia. And I think maybe to wrap up, because our webinar is ending soon, but maybe if anyone wants to come in with more inspiring practices or other good stories, please feel free. Nadia, if you want.
Yes, maybe I can already show light from UN perspective. The UN Department on Disaster Risk Reduction on European level, they had a kind of European roadmap on how to include all the minorities very fast by fast tracking and to include them. And so they set up a group, really a group with a lot of different organizations working together with them. And they financed more than 100 civil society representatives to go to the global platform in Bali last year and to participate. And it was not only being there, but they were part of the round tables, part of also the places where decisions were made by the member states on how to reduce disaster risk reduction and how to implement them better. So for once, from donor perspective, it was for once a good practice. But there is always a but. But then again, when we come back, then the reality between the commitments from the member states, translating them back to action on local level, there is then again that gap that we still need to lobby on. But it was really something very good. Well done.
Okay, that's very interesting. So I see now there's a few more questions coming in, but we have limited time. So um, I see one more for Lavinia. You mentioned about the just transition narrative for the Global South. Could you explain the purpose of this narrative? You're muted, Lavinia.
Sorry, it always happen. Huh? It was about time. So yeah, the Just Transition for the Global South is a project that we are running here at Solidar. The idea is to collect voices from the Global South and see what do they intend when we talk about just transition. So we cannot have just our own idea, as I said, put on them, but to understand what do they mean when we talk about just transition. What is just transition for the Global South? What do they need? Where are they aimed to? We need to understand what are the needs. So we are running these workshops where all the participants are coming from countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, and we are collecting their advocacy demands that they would like to bring forward about the challenges that they're living, and also the incoherences of EU policies when it comes to just transition, because sometimes the EU doesn't take into account, as I said, the consequences of its own policies. For example, I don't know, export banning products that are made from deforestation, which is, I mean, of course, is a great policy, but in some countries in Africa, for example, local communities live from that. They cannot, they need to cut the trees. So then you're hindering the way of life of the local community. So it's fundamental that these views are taken into account, and that's the purpose of this project. I have many concrete examples that I can give for this, but I don't know if I have the time, so I will stop here. But yeah, the purpose is really to collect their voices and the messages, and have an advocacy that we can bring forward in front of the EU.
Okay, well, that's also very valuable to know, and then I'm sure many of the audience can also check out this project under Solidar. So I think we can do one final question for Federico that just came in on your view on the European citizens panels that followed after the conference on the future of Europe. Federico, please.
Yes, very shortly, I'm aware of the time. Yes, so I presume the question refers to the new generation of citizens panels that followed the conference. And indeed, three citizens panels have been held ever since the end of the conference on the future of Europe. And we've had the chance to follow most of them, both online and in person. And with regard to the process itself, my opinion is essentially very positive. I have to say that the Commission and the facilitators organized it very well. It was really a place where I saw a lot of deliberation, a lot of discussions, and really a good plan and essentially structure to come up with concrete proposals which are accessible online. Maybe with respect to a bit like the broader picture of the citizens panels, again, I believe that there's a lot of room for improvement when it's about the choice of the topic, because as many of us have already said, it's very important to involve groups and experts also in the really preliminary stage of these exercises, because essentially the Commission, based on, of course, the call for recommendation, but the Commission came up with the topics discussed in the citizens panels that, and perhaps a further exchange would be much more welcome. And then again, representation, further inclusion of certain groups, especially historically underrepresented groups, minorities, and also maybe more time would have been necessary for citizens, for the participants, to maybe get to know a bit more about the topic and maybe have a bit more expertise. But apart from that, in general, it's really great. Now, of course, we're waiting for a proper follow-up. And but a few days ago, I spoke to a few people from the Commission, and they're in this moment now, and we're expecting a new generation of citizens panels by the end of the year. So I very much look forward to that.
Okay, thank you so much, Federico. And on this positive note, I would like to wrap up this webinar. So thanks a lot to all our great speakers today. I think it has been extremely enriching to have all these different perspectives on different marginalized groups, and also some more inspiring practices and concrete examples. I'm also very happy about the lively discussion that took place on social media, and especially on YouTube as well. So I think for myself, I will also have a few key takeaways from this, because I think I also learned a lot. Just to say that I think in all the speakers' discussions, it came up that a lot of the well-intended policies may have negative or unintended spillover effects that need to be considered. And also take note that not one size fits all. So there's really a need for a more tailored, inclusive approach, and to also not just see it as a sort of ethical imperative, but also recognize the strategic advantage that the involvement of different communities, also indigenous knowledge, can bring in this regard. And yes, also for the citizens panels, that these are a useful tool, but of course they can be improved. So with this, I would like to wrap up and thank again the great speakers, the organizers of the Real Deal project. You can also check out the website of the project if you want to stay more involved. And then I wish you a very nice evening. So thanks a lot. Bye-bye.